On the morning of November 13th, 2022, the college town of Moscow, Idaho, woke up to something unthinkable. The streets were quiet, the sun was rising over the hills, and students at the University of Idaho were slowly shaking off the weekend. But at 1122 King Road, something was very, very wrong. Inside that three-story house, 4 young students had been murdered in the middle of the night, and no one outside those walls had any idea. By sunrise, a killer had vanished. 4 lives were gone, and an entire community was about to be gripped by fear. This is the story of the Idaho student murders, and how a single mistake by the killer would set off one of the most intense manhunts in modern history. They were not just names in a headline. They were friends, roommates, a boyfriend and girlfriend. Kaylee Goncalves, 21 years old, smart, confident, ready to start a new chapter in her life. She had just graduated early, had a new job waiting for her, and was in town to show off her car and spend time with her best friend, Madison Mogan, also 21. Kaylee's closest friend since middle school. They were inseparable, the kind of friends who knew each other's thoughts without speaking. Madison was warm, social, and always surrounded by friends. Zana Kernodle, 20 years old, quick-witted, athletic, someone who could turn any bad day into a laugh. She worked hard, juggled her studies, and loved spending time with her boyfriend, Ethan Chapin. Ethan Chapin, also 20, easygoing, the type of guy who could walk into a room and make everyone feel welcome. He was an athlete, a brother, and a son. That Saturday night, they were just college kids doing what college kids do, hanging out with friends, going to parties, enjoying a weekend. None of them knew they were living the last hours of their lives. The house at 1122 King Road was known as a lively place. From the outside, it looked ordinary, a beige 3-story home sitting on a slope near campus. But for the students who lived there, it was more than a house. It was a social hub. The top floor belonged to Kaylee and Madison. The middle floor was where Zana lived, and that's where Ethan often stayed. The bottom floor had 2 other roommates. There were no locks between the floors, no security cameras inside. The living room was often filled with people dropping by at all hours. Friends came and went freely, and no one thought much about it. It felt safe. It felt normal, and that false sense of safety would prove dangerous. The morning after, 2 surviving roommates woke up. At first, nothing seemed out of place, but soon confusion set in. One of them found what they thought was an unconscious person on the 2nd floor. At 11:58 a.m., a 911 call went out. The report was simple: an unconscious person. When police arrived, they expected a medical emergency. What they found instead was a crime scene unlike anything they had ever seen. 4 victims, multiple stab wounds, no signs of forced entry, no sign of the killer, and no murder weapon. The surviving roommates were unharmed, but shaken. Neighbors watched as investigators swarmed the property, taping off the area and moving with grim urgency. In the first public statement, police said there were unattended deaths. The truth was much darker. Behind the scenes, investigators already knew. They were hunting a killer. As officers processed the house, something caught their attention. It wasn't large, it wasn't obvious, but it didn't belong there. On the bed next to one of the victims lay a black leather knife sheath, The weapon was gone, but on the snap button of that sheath was a single trace of DNA. The killer had been careful, but in that moment, he'd made the one mistake that would change everything. Investigators didn't know who the DNA belonged to yet. They didn't know the killer's name or his face. But this was the start of the hunt. On the bed, next to one of the victims, lay a black leather knife sheath. At first glance, it was nothing more than an accessory, a small, ordinary object. But it was the kind of thing you don't expect to find in the middle of a crime scene. Unless it belongs to the killer. The weapon itself was gone. The murderer had taken it with him. But the sheath? He had left it behind. And on the snap button, so small you could barely see it without a microscope, was a trace of DNA. Invisible to the naked eye, but impossible to hide from science. The killer may have thought he had covered his tracks. But in that moment, without knowing it, he had left behind his ghost. Crime labs operate on precision, patience, and quiet urgency. The DNA sample from the sheath was sent to the Idaho State Crime Lab immediately. Technicians extracted the genetic material, amplified it, and fed the sequence into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. If the killer had ever been arrested for a felony in the United States, if his DNA had been taken during any prior investigation, this was the moment his name would appear. The results came back quickly. No match. That single result told investigators something important. Their suspect had likely never been arrested for a major crime. No violent record, no felony. On paper, he didn't exist. The case had hit a wall. The DNA was pure, but without a name, it was useless. And that's when investigators turned to one of the most controversial and powerful tools in modern policing: investigative genetic genealogy. Unlike CODIS, genealogy databases don't need the killer's DNA to be in the system. Instead, they look for relatives, anyone who shares enough genetic markers to suggest a family connection. A cousin, an uncle, a distant relative you've never met, but who uploaded their DNA to find out about their ancestry. Investigators uploaded the DNA profile to a public genealogy site used for law enforcement searches. Slowly, the system began returning hits, not direct matches, but family links. It was like building a family tree. Backward. From distant relatives to closer ones, until a pattern began to take shape. One branch of that tree pointed to a cluster of people in Pennsylvania, and in that cluster, a name emerged: Brian Kohberger. Kohberger was 28 years old, a criminology PhD student at Washington State University, just 10 miles away from Moscow, Idaho. To investigators, that was a chilling detail. This wasn't someone with no understanding of crime. This was a man studying how criminals think, how they move, and how they get caught. And there was more. Kohberger drove a white Hyundai Elantra. It was the same make and color captured on neighborhood security cameras the night of the murders, circling the victim's home multiple times between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. His physical description, tall, thin, with bushy eyebrows, loosely matched what one surviving roommate reported seeing as a masked figure slipped out of the house that night. The pieces were starting to fit. But the police needed confirmation. The FBI began round-the-clock surveillance. They watched as Kohberger finished his semester in Washington, then drove across the country to his parents' home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, for the holidays. In the quiet Pennsylvania neighborhood, investigators set up covert operations. One night, they retrieved trash bags from the Kohberger family's garbage cans. Inside, they found a discarded item containing DNA from Brian's father. When the lab compared it to the sheath DNA, the probability of the match was astronomical, far beyond coincidence. The odds of it not being from Kohberger's family were less than 1 in a trillion. At this point, the investigators knew the hunt was over. It was time to move in. At 1 a.m. on December 30th, 2022, a SWAT team moved in under the cover of darkness. Neighbors were startled awake by the sound of armored vehicles and shouted commands. Within minutes, Kohberger was in custody. He didn't resist. Inside the home, officers found a black mask, gloves, and a dark hoodie, items eerily similar to those described by the surviving roommate. They seized his Hyundai Elantra for forensic testing and collected his phone records. The suspect was extradited to Idaho to face 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. But this was just the beginning. Because once the trial began, the public would hear details about the night of the murders that would shake them all over again. Brian Kohberger had been arrested, charged, and brought back to Idaho. But in the American justice system, an arrest is not the same as a conviction. Now, the focus shifted from the investigation to the courtroom, where the state would have to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that this man was responsible for the brutal murders of 4 University of Idaho students. The families of the victims sat just feet away from the man, accused of taking their loved ones' lives. Every word, every piece of evidence would be heard not just by a jury, but by parents, siblings, and friends who had been living in a nightmare for months. The prosecution opened with their strongest card, the DNA match from the knife sheath. The odds of it belonging to anyone other than Kohberger were astronomical, far beyond reasonable doubt. Then came the surveillance footage. Multiple cameras captured a white Hyundai Elantra driving near the King Roadhouse in the early morning hours of November 13th. The car was seen looping through the area, sometimes circling back. Investigators argued that this wasn't coincidence. It was hunting behavior. Cell phone records told another story. Kohberger's phone had connected to towers near the victim's home at least 12 times in the months leading up to the murders. But during the critical window, between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., the phone was turned off. When it powered back on later that morning, it pinged near a rural area investigators believed could have been used to discard evidence. Perhaps the most haunting testimony came from a surviving roommate who described waking to see a masked man dressed in black, walking calmly past her toward the sliding glass door. She froze, too shocked to scream, too terrified to move. The prosecution painted a chilling picture. A man who planned his attack, stalked his victims, and carried out the murders with precision, but left behind one mistake that unraveled it all. The defense worked to chip away at the state's narrative. They questioned whether the eyewitness account could be reliable in low light from a brief glance. They argued that the white Hyundai Elantra was a common car. Hundreds existed in the surrounding area. They challenged the interpretation of the DNA, suggesting it could have been transferred indirectly. And they reminded the jury that no murder weapon had been found, and no direct video showed Kohberger entering or leaving the house. Their strategy wasn't to prove innocence, but to plant doubt, enough to prevent a unanimous verdict. The moment that shifted the trial came when prosecutors revealed Kohberger's digital footprint after the murders. He had searched online for news about the case repeatedly, sometimes just minutes after new details were released. More disturbing, Investigators discovered he had joined online discussion groups speculating about the killer's identity. And in those groups, under a pseudonym, he appeared to comment, steering conversations, asking questions only someone with inside knowledge might ask. The jury listened in silence. The image forming wasn't of a detached academic, but of a man unable to resist revisiting his crime. Facing overwhelming evidence and the possibility of the death penalty, Brian Kohberger entered a guilty plea to 4 counts of first-degree murder. In court, the families of Kaylee, Madison, Zana, and Ethan gave victim impact statements. Some spoke through tears, others through anger. All spoke of futures stolen, milestones that would never come, and the hole left in their lives. The judge sentenced Kohberger to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict brought justice, but no one in that room would call it closure. Many people still wonder, how could one person kill 4 young adults without screams that woke the house or alerted neighbors? The answer is grim. The victims were in separate rooms. Investigators believe the attack happened quickly, 1 floor at a time, while most were asleep. In the shock of a sudden attack, seconds can pass before anyone reacts. And in this case, it was over before help could come. If there's anything we can take from this tragedy, it's that safety begins before danger arrives. Lock your doors, even in safe neighborhoods. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Know your exits, your escape routes, and keep your phone nearby at night. Danger doesn't give warning. And being prepared mentally can save precious seconds when seconds matter most. Tonight, we remember Kaylee Gonkovs, Madison Mogan, Zana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. They were laughter in the kitchen, whispered secrets on the couch, hugs at the door. They were futures filled with promise. May their families find comfort in knowing their children are remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived. And may we honor their memory by living with more awareness, more care, and more kindness toward one another. Before we close this chapter, here's something about this case you might not have thought about, and it could make all the difference in your own safety. This crime wasn't solved because of a lucky break. It wasn't solved because someone confessed. It was solved because of one piece of overlooked evidence, the knife sheath, and the science that connected it to the suspect. Here's why this matters for you. Most criminals don't think they've left anything behind. But in reality, we always leave traces, a fingerprint, a hair, a camera catching a reflection, a digital breadcrumb in our phone. That's true for criminals. And it's also true for victims trying to survive. If you ever feel unsafe, think about the evidence trail you can leave behind on purpose. A text message with your location. Dropping a personal item somewhere visible. Making noise that neighbors or passersby can hear. Even touching surfaces intentionally to leave fingerprints if someone is trying to harm you. You can't control everything, but you can increase the chances that someone will find you, help you, or hold an attacker accountable. The Idaho case reminds us that sometimes justice comes from the smallest detail. And sometimes that detail is the one you decide to leave behind. If you followed this story from the beginning, you now know the truth. And if you believe stories like this should be told, subscribe, because some fates were never meant to stay hidden. Thank you.